in order for everyone to grow, everyone has to be overstepping a little bit. If you're just doing your job and everyone's just doing the job they're at, I don't know how you ever promote anyone.
So Dan, as the VP of Marketing for the Chicago Bulls, I'd like to kick off this conversation by asking you, in the office space, you as an employee, have you ever received negative feedback that was particularly hard for you to hear? And what was that like, and what did it teach you about giving feedback in the workspace?
I think one I heard earlier in my career was, because I've always been comfortable having difficult conversations, sometimes that can come across cold, right? If it feels like you're critiquing and you're giving feedback and everything, occasionally like people just want to get a attaboy or a good job or a high five, right? And the feedback I got was really, it's significantly easier to give people critical developmental feedback if they know that you care about them as a person. And so if you go straight in and you're like, hey, I need you to get better at X, Y, and Z, it kind of comes across, it can come across a bit aggressive. And so that was feedback that I received earlier in my career was, hey, if you're going to give this developmental feedback, which we do believe it is important to do, don't forget to invest in developing a relationship that's based around trust. Because they're going to hear you. They're going to be able to listen a lot more to what you're saying. And so even, just little things, right? I try and start every one-on-one I have with everyone just to ask how things are going in their life, not how things are going in work. Because the more you can start building trust and a relationship, doesn't need to be a friendship, but a relationship, that makes it a lot easier when you have to give some feedback.
What conversation topics, if any, do you believe should be off limits at the workspace?
Clearly, getting into certain topics is going to be controversial, right? And you need to be incredibly contextually aware. Who am I with? Where am I? Who can overhear it? Who could potentially be upset by hearing these comments? The reason I say I don't think any topic's off limits is like, if an employee comes to you and they want to talk about a topic because it's top of mind for them, or whether it's something that's going on in their personal life or something that's going on in professional life, if you create an environment where they can't talk about those topics, I don't know how you have the conversation, right? And so I think you have to, as a leader, you have to be willing to have those conversations, but you need to make sure you're hiring people with high EQ, right? That can be like, okay, this is not the appropriate time to bring up a political conversation, but let's say when you're sitting at dinner with a client, right? Like there's certain things that you just need to be smart about when you're bringing it up.
If you're looking for a new job and you don't have the Indeed mobile app, you're seriously missing out. Click the link below or search Indeed in the App Store.
Do you have any advice for taking the lead at work without overstepping?
Yeah, I tell people on my team all the time, like I think everyone's scared about overstepping. Every good boss I've worked for and every good employee I've had oversteps all the time because I think if you have, at the Bulls, for example, we have coordinators, managers, senior managers, directors, senior directors, VPs, senior VPs. I always say if someone who reports to me is overstepping by 20%, that's taking 20% of my work, which lets me then overstep up, right? In order for everyone to grow, everyone has to be overstepping a little bit. If you're just doing your job and everyone's just doing the job they're at, I don't know how you ever promote anyone because you're like, okay, I know you're a really good coordinator, but you've done none of the things I need to see to have you be a manager. The only way you can get there is by overstepping a little bit. Would encourage people like be optimistic, be driven, like want to overstep, and then just, again, have the EQ and the relationships internally that allow you to do that.
Talking to your boss about your own career growth can be challenging. It can be super vulnerable. So what advice do you have when it comes to advocating for yourself in the workspace, especially sometimes with your superiors?
If you don't tell your boss where you want to go, your career is going to float. And it might float in a good direction and it might float in a bad direction. But if you're more vocal around like, hey, this is where I want to get to and these are the sorts of things that I would want to do to help me get there, it means that when I'm in a meeting and I hear that there's a project we need to find a volunteer for, I've got it top of mind. That person actually mentioned that they want to do these sorts of things. And so you should not be shy and hesitant at all about advocating for yourself, saying where you see yourself going, acknowledging that you might not be in the company that you're in forever, that there is a life outside that company as well. You can either not have the conversation and you just risk that your career kind of goes with the winds, right? Or you have the conversation and you actually have the ability to influence the sorts of projects and exposure you get.
So to wrap up this conversation, lastly, I want to ask you, who taught you how to navigate difficult conversations in your career, and what is the best piece of advice that you received from that?
It's funnily enough, it was my first week working for my first real job at an agency in London, and they had an all-staff training. It was called Courageous Conversation, and it was a training session just really around forcefully having difficult conversations, right? And don't bury it, like have the conversation. And there was something that they said there that really stuck with me, which is it is harder in the long run to not have difficult conversations because you start living in this world that isn't real. And if you have these difficult conversations, they're rarely as difficult as you think. The only real difficult bit is getting the first line out, right? Once you get the first line out, like, you flow from there. The conversation's open. You have they're asking you questions, you're talking. The only hard bit's getting the first line out, and not having it, as I say, I think is a lot worse than forcing yourself to have that conversation.